want to start by thanking the committee and thanking all of you for inviting me today. I'm really honored to be speaking to this group of people because I can see how deeply your hearts are in this work, how important it is to you, and how long this organization has been out there doing this important work and making sacrifices and taking on an issue that, frankly, a lot of us are afraid to take on. When someone mentioned that the rest of the world seems oblivious, my view is that the rest of the world is overwhelmed and doesn't believe that we can make any progress, and you all believe it, and you make something happen all the time. So I'm really honored to be here with you. I'm honored to have at moments participated at the edge of some of the work you've done. I've sometimes gone to the gates, never been arrested though. I've come to some of the amazing educational opportunities that you've provided here, some of the gatherings. I've had a chance to read your wonderful new comic. So I've had a chance to be at the edge of some of the work that you're doing, but I haven't actually ever taken it on in the way that you have. And I'm very humbled by that. And in fact, I started wondering why you had invited me to speak, because clearly there are many people, probably everybody in this room knows more about the issues around nuclear weapons than I do. So clearly you weren't asking me to share that. So I thought, well, maybe what you're interested in is the work that I have done, which has been based on my lifelong obsession with the question of how change happens. How can ordinary people create big changes in the world? And that's a question I've had that has been front and center of my life ever since I was a child living in India with my family and seeing the injustice and poverty. And also as a child in the segregated South, seeing the racism and the inequality and wondering how that happened and what could I do as a child, which was nothing, but what could I do as I grew up? Maybe there was something I could do. And I made a promise to myself during those experiences that as a kid I couldn't do anything, but I was not going to let go of the question. And when I could find a way forward, I was going to be part of that. So that question has been with me for a very long time. I co-founded Yes Magazine in 1996 as partly for myself as a vehicle for answering that question. Because I figured as a journalist, I wanted to know not only what were the sources of inequality, of sources of militarism, the sources of injustice, not only what the root causes were, but what were people doing about it? Because to me, if the old way of doing things is dying, the old way of doing things is on its way out because of things like, clearly things like climate change, or an indicator, that's not the root cause, but it's an indicator that our way of life is not working anymore, our system. There are people who are creating a new future, because I didn't think we or anybody else was going to come up with that on their own. But as a journalist, I could go around and see what people were choosing to create by what they chose to do in their communities on a daily basis. And, oops. Well, that was a close one. That's all right. So in the process, I had the opportunity to meet extraordinary people like yourselves, doing really brave and really beautiful and really creative work all over the country, and to learn some of what it took to make those kinds of things work. So I want to talk about a few things that I think are absolutely fundamental to building the power to make real change, and things that I learned over the years of doing that research. So, first one has to do with having a vision. For more than 10 years, I've traveled with the Suquamish tribe on the annual canoe journey. And every year, we go anywhere from a few miles to hundreds of miles to a destination. Usually, we can see the land from where we are. Usually we have GPS instruments with us so we can navigate. And usually we do this with complete safety. Not always. But it's quite different for the Polynesian voyagers who traveled traditionally without instruments and traveled way out of sight of land. They'd go thousands of miles from one small island to another. And somehow they found their way. So what was the secret to their navigation? Punani Burgess, who was a board member of the Yes magazine, is native Hawaiian, and she would talk about the stories of the navigators and what they had learned about how to find their way. And of course, some of it was the stars and looking at what was on the horizon, was above the horizon. Some of it was the bird patterns, because the migratory birds would give them a sense of direction, and also the birds that were coming near the islands were different than the birds that were out in the middle of the ocean. Some was finding the currents through the ocean that were like rivers that could take them where they wanted to go. So they had all that deep knowledge, but the other thing she kept emphasizing was the navigator had to be able to see the island that they were heading for as though it was real. They had to have such a clear picture of where they were going that stayed front and center in their minds and heart as they were making their way through this open ocean. And I think there's something about that notion of having that kind of clear vision of where you're going to. And what would it look like today for us to see that kind of nonviolent future that we're hoping for? Can we actually imagine it? We won't get there just by being hard workers, just by having a beautiful vessel. We won't get there just by being prepared. We have to see the outcome that we believe to be possible. So let's talk about what it would take to get that kind of vision, because we're in a really tough time right now. A lot of people already mentioned that. The election of Donald Trump last week makes it even more clear that the world is at a time where everything we thought we could count on is being upended. And I don't just mean that the extinction of massive numbers of species, even the possible extinction of the human species, the extractive enterprises that are ruining the planet, whether those are fossil fuel or military-industrial complex or the prison-industrial complex. We may have reached the point where any number of hazards, from nuclear annihilation to ecological collapse to having a new AI overlord take over, could mean that civilizations can't continue. More immediately, we're living at a time when a man who fits any definition of fascist will soon become president. The damage he has teed up will affect everyone and everything we care about, the most vulnerable first. Every ecosystem, community, value, and the relationships among all of these. So how do we move forward in a time when there's this much chaos? Well, part of the answer is keeping our eye on that prize, which I think is one of the things that Ground Zero has so much to be proud of, is having that clarity of vision for so many years. And I'd like us to spend some time today thinking more about what that actually looks like in practice. What does it look to hold up the mission, which has both the element of eliminating nuclear weapons, but also has the element of deepening nonviolence as a practice and as an understanding? What would it mean to do that? And what is it we're trying to achieve? Is it the US signing and ratifying the treaty on the prohibition of nuclear weapons? Is it supporting the blossoming of nonviolent beloved communities as an alternative to violent polarization and soul-crushing isolation? Might those two actually work in tandem? What is the destination we seek for Ground Zero? And what might it look like in 10 years if you've been successful beyond your imagination? Because humanity needs you to be successful. So that's one thing, is getting clear on the outcome we're after. Getting that sense of vision front and center. And that's one of the sources of power of social movements, is having that kind of clarity. There are other sources of power, because some people are uncomfortable with using the term power, but actually if we want to get something done, that is a form of power, even if it's a nonviolent form of power. And other folks who may feel differently about some of these issues, for example, the leaders of the military-industrial complex, they have power and they exert it without hesitation. And that power takes the form of enormous amounts of money that they can use to influence policy. And it takes the form of access to the power structure in Washington, D.C. and around the world. So there are forms of power that we don't have access to. But what are the kinds of power that we do have access to and that we can wield without hesitation, because these are kinds of power that are nonviolent, that are basically ethical, moral ways of exerting people power. We don't have to apologize for exerting power. So one of them is that clarity of vision. I want to suggest a couple of others that I think Ground Zero can access. One is to embrace your elderhood. So I think some organizations might look around the room and say, wow, we all have white hair. We must be getting irrelevant. Okay, not everybody here, but a lot of us. And I'm certainly among them. I'm 68 years old and I'm getting ready to retire this year. So, so let's talk about that. Elders have a really important role in many cultural societies, in many cultures, in many traditional societies. They have a role that's different than adults. In fact, it may be as different than middle-aged adults as childhood is to adolescence. It's a major transition in life. And what does that mean when we make that transition? Well, for a lot of traditional societies, it means both huge respect for the wisdom and the knowledge that's accumulated, and the historic knowledge, and the ability to see beyond one's immediate family. Because in a lot of societies, people are very focused on their families when they're in the stage of life where they're raising children. But once their children are grown, sure, they're looking after their grandchildren maybe, but they also have that ability to have that larger view of the common good. And elders can tap into that and provide a really important means for keeping the common good front and center. So elders bring some really important strengths. However, in many societies, elders don't hang on to formal sources of power. Elders turn that over in various ways to people who are in the next generation or next generations. And there are good reasons for that too. Part of it is the energy that younger people have as they sort of have that drive to accomplish. Part of it is the creativity that comes from not being stuck in any old patterns that may or may not still be useful. Part of it is that the next generations have grown up in worlds that are unlike the worlds we grew up in. I mean, I grew up protesting the Vietnam War. Okay, that set my sort of worldview, a sort of foundational part of my worldview. But young people, a lot of young people grew up maybe at the time of 9/11 or at the time of the Afghan and Iraq war, and many of them served in that war in some capacity. Some of them are growing up having their formative years during COVID and the isolation and mental health challenges that have gone with that. So young people are growing up in each one in different formative stages, which is kind of obvious to say, but that also informs what they bring to the table and what they understand about the larger society and what the larger society is looking for. So if we don't have their wisdom in the mix, we're missing something. Gilberto, yeah.
I'm sorry, I have a deep question that's bothered me for a long time. I'm going to say that I'm off the reservation. And when I think about the Council of Elders and the respect, and then I come to this world and it's committee and it's very dry. It's a different way of communicating, and sometimes it doesn't make sense. So I don't know how to bring native ways or other cultures into this culture, which is probably about liabilities and, you know, something doesn't make any sense against nuclear weapons. I mean, I'm thinking of stopping war. When you get into all these little tidbits of information that makes no sense to me. That's all I'm saying.
Okay, well, thank you. And it's an interesting question. I think you're pinpointing what may be one of the tensions in this organization, and maybe we can address that further, because I think it is a good question. So I'm making a case here, of course, for a more intergenerational movement. And of course, the nuclear freeze movement was quite, if I remember right, I was at the edge of that one too. If I remember right, it was quite youth-led. In fact, when I first moved to Portland in 1976, as a fairly young person, the people that I first met had been up here trying to stop the shipments of armaments from Bangor or from somewhere around here out to Vietnam.
Right here.
Yeah. So I was like 19 years old, and those people were like, wow, what did you just do? Anyway, so young people have this creative spark. And what's really powerful is when we have it all in the room together, right? I also want to just make a case that I think young people are really suffering at a rate that we don't quite fathom. I mean, there's the huge economic issues about people not even being able to afford a home and taking jobs that are really soul-crushing, that are just really beyond what I think a lot of us experienced. I remember when I was a kid, you could go to college by working summers, and you could pay your way through college. You can't do that now. So it's just so many levels of debt and isolation and all the social. So there's a lot of pain being experienced in younger groups. When you all invited me to come speak, I just asked a few people I know in Kitsap, have you heard of Ground Zero? And one of the things several of them said was, oh yeah, they did that nonviolence training when we were doing our Gaza events. And they really appreciated that. They really appreciated that they had a place to come where they could do the work they felt that they needed to do for nonviolence, for peace. And they would be welcomed in, and they would be provided with some of the skills and some of the knowledge and some of the experience that they desperately needed. Because they wanted to go downtown Bremerton, right in front of the base, and talk about Gaza, and talk about genocide, and talk about ending war. And they were scared, they're going to go out there and who knows who's going to show up. You may or may not know Kitsap County is a center of right-wing extremist groups. They didn't know who was going to show up. And you guys stepped up and provided them with exactly what they needed. They needed that nonviolence training to feel comfortable doing that event. So that little spark of appreciation just made me think, how much more could be done like that? That Ground Zero could bring in opportunities for young people to connect to each other, to learn new skills, to deal with their isolation by finding people with a common purpose. Even, again, I'm thinking back to Vietnam, I remember there used to be these coffee houses where people up for the draft, afraid of getting drafted, or active military being considered for being deployed to Vietnam, where they could gather and talk to each other and learn from each other and get support. What if Ground Zero actually provided that kind of support to people here in the Navy? Maybe you already do this. Here in the Navy, who are wondering what they will do if President Trump should decide that it's time to fire off those nuclear weapons. Right? I mean, there's people who are going to have to be deciding if they're going to follow those orders, or if they're going to be part of a machine that is going to follow those orders. They're going to be making some very serious moral judgments. Could you provide a space where those who are having some doubts could safely describe their doubts to each other and learn from some of you who have so much more experience and so much more wisdom to bring into that conversation, but mainly to listen, because people have to go through their own moral decision making. Okay, I'm sorry, I'm getting carried away with number 2. Number 3, and this is actually quite related, create community. Because we have the need for a vision. We have the need for that intergenerational learning and teaching. Oh, I'm sorry, I need to go back to one other thing in the second one. Because one of the things that has been really clear to me for quite a while is the way in which younger people are far more tuned into the racial and gender injustice of our country. And my experience is they are absolutely not okay with participating in an organization that does not think deeply about that. So it's not a question of saying, well, we have to have X number of people of color in the room to be a legitimate organization. It's a question of saying, has each of us done our homework personally? Have we done our homework as a group to understand what that history is and to understand how we each can be either perpetrating it or undoing it? Because the history of the United States is built on this deep violence. It's the deepest violence at the core of who we are, okay? The theft, the violent genocide theft of Native American land, and the violent enforced enslavement of African people, and the exploitation of labor from immigrants, the exploitation of resources from people around the world. These are deeply violent and deeply at the core of what this nation is and has done and continues to do and to justify. And it's at the core, I believe, of the whole military-industrial enterprise, is continuing to be able to create wealth here by exerting violence all around the world. So it's both global, but it's also very particular to our work and to our internal lives. And if we don't do the work, we cannot be an organization that welcomes people of various different racial and ethnic backgrounds, because we don't have enough of a common understanding to be safe, to be a safe place to be vulnerable. And that's a place where your work with young people could be very useful, because just as you have things to teach them, there's a lot of young people who've done a lot of serious work on this and have a lot that could teach this organization, if there's openness to it. Okay, the third one has to do with creating a sense of community. And we did a little bit of that work this morning just by introducing ourselves and being a little bit extra vulnerable by saying, here's where I'm struggling. Okay. Somehow it just feels weird to look at myself in this monitor while I'm talking, so I keep wanting to get out of the shot. Okay. So I would recommend that you take seriously the work it takes to build a community that is also an organization, also an activist organization. Now, when I was a young mother, I had a newborn baby, I was working full time, I had a second child who was just a toddler, and I wanted to collaborate with friends on building the co-housing community that's now on Bainbridge Island. And I wanted to get through that as fast as possible because, frankly, I had no time. Okay? I just wanted a place to live where I could raise my children in a community that would make sense. So I was really interested in going fast. The other people in this group were saying, oh no, we got to spend at least half of our time community building. And I'm like, what the heck? I don't have time for this. But they insisted. I was wrong. We did it. And because we took the time to listen to each other, to get to know each other, to build trust, to build understanding, so we knew what other people cared about, because we were able to do that, we actually did build a 30-unit, $4 million project by consensus, and then it thrived once we moved in. And we were able to make decisions and get over tough things that came up once we were all living together. So there's no getting around it. It seems time-consuming to those of us who are a little type A and we just want to get shit done. It seems like we're just spinning our wheels when we try to do community building. But I don't believe you can actually create the foundations for powerful and risky action without that community building. Now, maybe I'm already preaching to the choir. Maybe you already do that. But what I'm hearing is that there are some really significant issues in this group that are not being addressed. I don't know what the right or wrong answer, if there is a right or wrong answer, but I do believe that it takes time to really hear everybody, because you've made the choice to make decisions by consensus. The only way consensus can function is if every voice is not only given an opportunity to block consensus, which is sort of the ultimate shutdown, but every voice is heard so that that wisdom becomes part of the eventual resolution. And that takes time. There's just no getting around it taking time. So I want to encourage you to spend the time it takes to get to, not just as a problem solving, but as a deep listening, as a deep spiritual practice. And as you're doing that, you're also creating the possibility for becoming more of a beloved community, which is deeply attractive to other people to become part of, right? I mean, people don't want to become part of an organization that's full of strife and people crossing their arms and looking the other way. They want to become part of an organization where people are authentically present because they're real with each other. Not that all the problems go away, but that there's a means of listening and going through them. So once you do that, I believe you actually end up being able to attract a whole new group of people who will want to be part of that. And you can, as mentioned earlier, some of those training and gathering opportunities can also create that sense of community with the larger Kitsap and potentially Seattle and beyond community. And basically, when we look at forms of power, vision, intergenerational, I think solidarity, which is another word for community, is the most important thing we have. Because if we're alone, we really can't do anything. When we're together, when we have serious solidarity, we can do almost anything. Okay. So let me just wrap up. I think this could be a really big year for Ground Zero. You have a number of things going on that are pretty extraordinary. It's the year when the Nobel Peace Prize went to the Haibak-Lusha. And it's a year when the Trump presidency is raising awareness of the extreme hazard of nuclear armaments. We have the treaty, which a number of nations around the world, maybe most of the nations around the world that are not nuclear powers, have signed, saying nuclear weapons should be illegal. The US has chosen to ignore that. We don't have to let that be ignored. You have an amazing comic book out, which I believe could really help spread the word. People are looking for ways to have an impact, and I believe Ground Zero is one of those ways. So, I believe that if you choose to focus on your vision, focus on building that sense of community and solidarity, find ways of not just reaching younger people to be part of what you have, but being open to letting them change what you have, I believe that extraordinary change is possible. So thank you for inviting me to speak my mind and for being a provocateur.